Grace and is it Tamara or Tamara? Tamara. All right, would you be ready to go?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Grace.
Okay. So session 3 is called Strategies for Overcoming Interpersonal Communication Barriers, led by Grace Atkinson, Program Manager at FSU, and Tamara Gabris, Program Director at UCF. Thank you both.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'll start out with introductions. My name is Grace Atkinson, and I have been at FSU in the Office of Research for 10 years as of next Tuesday. Yay. The first half of my time at FSU was over in sponsored research, and more recently, the last 5 years, I've been in the Office of Research Development. And as I mentioned earlier, I run the majority of the Office of Research's internal funding programs through the heading of the Council on Research and Creativity.
And my name is Tamara Gabris, and I have been at UCF 15 years as of February. And I started out in the central office as a senior proposal and contract manager. I was there for 10 years, and then I transitioned to the faculty cluster initiative 5 years ago. And last year, we started a new unit under our purview called Pre-Award Shared Services, which provides pre-award support for units that didn't otherwise have support. And we also manage their large interdisciplinary proposals. And the third component to that has been providing ad hoc support when needed for units that have some turnover, which if anyone has been watching remote activities and offers, we have had some losses here at UCF. So I'm sure that is likewise in other areas. So
we're going to just talk a little bit about, well, this is the nice long title, but actually what it boils down to is how to deal with difficult individuals, faculty members, just pretty much anyone, how to have good communications when there's a breakdown in communication. So we're going to do that by going over some helpful tips. Nothing is rocket science. You probably already know all of this, but just good reminders, and then talk through some case studies for how to apply that in our work setting. So next slide, please. So we're going to start off with the golden rule versus the platinum rule. So pretty much everybody learned the golden rule as a child, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or something similar. And that's a really good starting point, especially with children, to kind of get them to grasp the idea of just how to treat others with just basic decency. But as you kind of bring in some emotional maturity into that, you realize it's kind of missing something. And that's where the platinum rule comes into play. And that is treat others as they would like to be treated. And that makes all the difference in the world, just that little shift in focus, because it takes the focus off of you and puts it on the other person. And by focusing on the other person, you're showing that you respect them as an individual and you value them and what they bring to the table. And it's not something that you're condescending or you're being subservient, but it's just respecting them as who they are, where they are. And it's not always the easiest thing, but it helps build that relationship. And that's kind of what all our jobs are about, and just what any kind of interactions are between people is just relationship building. And conflict has the opposite effect. So that's what we want to do, is just kind of keep this foundational principle of the platinum rule in mind as we talk about how to deal with these interpersonal issues. So next slide, please. So now that we have this basic foundation, we're going to take that and apply the platinum rule in the framework of awareness. And the first thing to do, kind of ingrained in that platinum rule, is your perspective. You switch your perspective and try to think of it how, when you're coming into conflict with this individual and in this situation, how are they seeing it from their point of view? A lot of times we'll jump to the defensive and try to defend our perspective and our point of view, but what does it look like to them? And if you make that conscious effort, it'll help you kind of lower your defenses and kind of see that, okay, maybe this isn't just the way that I'm perceiving it. Maybe this really does have some, some things that I didn't consider before. And so next, just remember that we are all human. We are all dealing with a lot of stress and a lot of different things coming at us right now, especially in this time of COVID and everything else in the world that's going on. So just remember how it feels when someone else gives you the benefit of the doubt, and try to remember to pass that graciousness on to the other person. And last of all, check yourself and kind of what your past baggage is that you're bringing into the situation. You know, we've all had, you know, conflicts in the past that have, you know, kind of changed our biases towards certain things. So just kind of be aware that you have those biases when you're approaching a new conflict, and try to not let that weigh too heavily on the conflict, and kind of separate that out and just evaluate the situation for what it is right now, because you don't want to take something that's not anywhere related to the current situation and make it worse unintentionally. So next slide. So once you have this awareness and you're faced with this conflict, what do? You know, in that moment. So the best thing to do for a lot of different things, but especially for this, is just to breathe. Take a breath, stand back for a moment, and just don't react immediately. Just take a second to breathe and just take a look at the situation. And you can kind of buy yourself a little time to collect your thoughts. There's different ways of doing this. If you're having this discussion by email or by a phone call, you can just ask the person politely if you can get back to them at a later time. And that way you have a chance to maybe do some research or think about the situation a little bit before you respond to them, and give you a better chance to respond in a helpful way. Sometimes, you know, it's a face-to-face conflict and you don't have that option to just come back to the situation. So what you can do in that case is to restate to that person what you heard them say. So that gives you a chance to kind of listen again to what it was that they said, but also buy yourself time to kind of gather your thoughts while you're saying that. And it also gives the other person the opportunity to maybe clarify their statement. If maybe there was just a miscommunication in what they said, but what they actually intended to say, that gives them an opportunity to kind of shape up what they actually intended to say. And then when it finally comes to being responsive to it, just respond in a calm and clear and honest manner. You can't always resolve the situation yourself. Maybe it's something that they're upset that they didn't get funded for a certain program or something like that, and you may not have any control over that. So in that situation, it's really helpful just to listen. A lot of times people just need to vent, and they need somebody to know that they're frustrated, and they just want somebody to acknowledge that. And you know, that may be all you can do in the situation. But if it is something that you have direct control over, listen to their point of view again, and try to be honest with them about why the resolution happened the way it did, maybe that they're upset about. So, you know, if it turns out that you're actually in the wrong, be honest about that and admit it. Don't try to cover it up, because that's just going to make things worse. But if it's something, maybe it's a policy issue that they didn't follow, just re-explain that policy to them and make sure they understand where the misstep was, and help them to see that, you know, this is something that can be fixed for the next time maybe, but, you know, stand your ground, and you don't have to give in to them, but to, you know, just be responsive and explain to them maybe what the situation was and how they can move forward from there. So I'm going to turn it over to Tamara now, and we're going to take some of these tips and apply them to some case studies. Next slide, please.
Okay, so following this case study, we're going to actually open up to a Jamboard. So listen in and then take away some ideas and share with our colleagues. So your institution requires proposals to be sent for initial SPO review 3 business days prior to the sponsor deadline. And missing the SPO deadline requires approval from senior leadership. Your department also has an internal deadline and requires proposals 5 business days before the SPO deadline to work on the application. A PI has missed the SPO deadline 1 time and the department deadline 3 times this year, and is about to miss the SPO deadline again. The day before the sponsor deadline, a critical document is still missing from the PI. SPO denies approval to proceed, citing the lack of time for review and your data on the frequency of the missed deadlines. The PI responds to everyone involved and says the department, i.e. you, has provided inaccurate information. The PI insists they only missed the SPO deadline one time and should be approved to proceed. How do you respond? So I believe we have a link in the chat to jump in on this Jamboard. What are some ways that we could respond to the faculty member? Also feel free to shout it out too. Okay, verify the facts in question. Facts being the previously submitted applications having missed the deadlines. Okay. Any other suggestions?
I see my supervisor and often deal very gracefully with these types of things over the phone. So it's a lot harder for people to be mad at you when you're talking to them and de-escalating. I don't know how well you de-escalate the email. So I think that she often is really great on the phone. So maybe pick.
Awesome. Yep. So adding in even like that personal approach, whether it's by phone or in person, to humanize the situation and who they're dealing with, get out from behind the computer or the keyboard. Okay. Do we have any other suggestions? We can do a postmortem later, but response should be, how do we get it done then? What is required and who should have it? Blame game isn't good. Fair enough. So how do we get past it? How do we move forward? What are the lessons learned? Shifting blame isn't going to help us. Clarify that director of SPO has final say on these issues. If the program has another upcoming deadline, remind them of this. That's an excellent point. Reiterating that it was not just the fact that the person had missed previous deadlines. It was the fact that we were coming up the day before the sponsor deadline and we still missed a critical document. So, kind of bringing it back to where we are today and why that application couldn't move forward in good faith. Verify facts. I think our college tries to be graceful about this sort of stuff. We tell people that they need to make deadlines, but we do our best if people miss deadlines. We remind the PI to do better. Okay, awesome. Any other suggestions here? Okay, well then I think we can go ahead and move on to case study 2. And I'm going to weigh in on these after the fact. So this case study number 2, you receive an email from a PI that a proposal you submitted months prior was not reviewed by the sponsor, citing that you were ineligible for the submission. You distinctly recall the submission, and while the FOA was conflicting, you found specific instructions that would support our eligibility. A debrief with the team is coming up, and you must determine the best path forward. What approach should you take into the debrief?
So this is assuming that the agency was wrong?
Yes, there was a conflict in the FOA language.
We've actually had this happen before. Typically speak to the program officer to make sure we understand what happened before we go into a debrief meeting. And then if it was our fault, we own it. If it wasn't, we try to work with the program officer to figure out something else.
Excellent. And the email or note confirming your eligibility you may have received from the sponsor,
Yeah, that's a good point.
program officer. Okay. Ooh. Y'all are really testing my eyesight. Outline efforts made to determine eligibility in order to show that a best effort was made. Good point.
The point about the email from the is excellent, because that should have been the first thing that was done before anyone advised the person of their eligibility. That's really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Awesome. Any more insight or input here? Okay. So why don't we head back to the slides? Well, thank you guys for your participation in that. And a little, as we were preparing for this, we basically knew that we wanted to expand with case studies and examples, because we recognize that what we're presenting today is not, groundbreaking novel information, but it is a friendly reminder, because to give yourself a little bit grace in a job that's already difficult, and especially as you're navigating extremely difficult conversations. So in case number 1, inaccurate information, the funny thing is that when we were preparing for these, I didn't know that my case studies would actually be 2 incidents that happened to me in the last 2 weeks. So they were very real and relevant for this presentation. So for case number 1, inaccurate information, I had to ask myself, is it an interpersonal issue? Discuss the situation respectfully and not defensively. And then what is the global issue and solution? So in case number 1, it was a situation as outlined where PI had indicated numerous times had missed the deadlines internally and then missed the deadline for the SPO office. But what was interesting here is my first inclination was to come back and respond to the entire group and say, no, it is accurate. Here are the proposals that were previously missed. Here are the times that, I had it charged. I was ready to go. I had my notes armed and ready to go. I wanted to respond to the same senior leadership that was copied on all of the emails. But I had to kind of take in what Grace had mentioned into her proposal or her presentation, which is I needed to take a breath. I needed to evaluate and then respond. So in this particular situation, after approaching my supervisor the day before, I'm like, yeah, we need to go back. We need to push back on this issue. We need to let them know that we're firm on this. The next day, I kind of came back a little bit more invigorated. And the reason is because I realized it was a global issue. So this wasn't about communication of deadlines. This wasn't about, providing clear and concise expectations or timelines, because my PI had that. My team member, my staff member, they had done that. But what it did rely on, and it brought, realization of, is that up and into that point, I felt that the faculty member did not have clear communication from us of when we were marking them late for proposals. So for example, if they had missed an internal deadline, I would mark them in my spreadsheet, but I wouldn't necessarily communicate to them, we're marking you as late for having missed this deadline. So when a waiver request comes forward now, we're actually going to change our form and incorporate in there the numbers of times in which they've been cited within that fiscal year as having missed the department and the sponsored programs office deadlines, so that it's clear and upfront. So I was able to respond and evaluate the situation and come back with a solution that I felt like was addressing more the global problem rather than that specific communication or incident. But additionally, I also felt like I had to take some ownership, because where did it go wrong? I think this is also an institutional culture issue where we have all these deadlines where we expect, proposals to come in within a number of days of the sponsored deadline. And we have a tendency, at least in my shop, we had a tendency to allow flexibility. So we will work with you. We will help you meet those deadlines. And maybe even in my situation, I would sacrifice a night or a weekend to make that happen. So I'm also not communicating that to them too. So making that basically as an undermining to a policy that's already difficult for faculty to embrace. Case number 2, the disqualified proposal. It was slightly different. I anonymized it slightly, but it did come back to conflicting language into the FOA. So essentially in the case that we are talking about, the primary FOA cited ineligible language, but there was a document actually uploaded to the application portal which verified our eligibility. So when we went into the debrief, my approach was actually to take Grace's consideration of taking their perspective, taking Grace to the human element, and checking myself, my ego, and the need to be right. So from their perspective, I put myself there and I recognize they are technical, they are not administrative, and they are not doing this on a day-to-day basis. So what they recognize and understand is that they put forward all of this effort and that proposal did not get reviewed. They see that with me and they recognize and trust that I'm doing my due diligence. So I had to put myself in their perspective as to why that system failed. Why did the process fail? So additionally, I wanted to give grace to the human element so that I recognize that I am human, I make mistakes, but also so does the sponsor. Everyone who plays a part in this process is human and can make a mistake. And I had to check myself, my ego, at the need to be right at the door, because I wanted to go in and immediately tell them, these are the facts. This is how it played out. This is how it happened. But I knew that at the end of the day, it wasn't going to bring closure to the situation. So what we ended up doing was we brought in a neutral set of eyes. We outlined the steps that we took and we escalated it to senior leadership, both in my office and the sponsored programs office, gave them the steps and asked them to evaluate whether or not the steps were appropriate. They actually went through the process. They felt like everything that we provided was accurate. So it was nice to have that validation, but it was not something that I touted. It was more to just understand that where the lessons learned. I also wanted to bring in support, because the other component to this is no matter how many years you've been in the business, having a support, even if it's just a fly on the wall, just to be there and cheerleading you on quietly in the meeting is going to help you get through it. And then additionally, I wanted to provide options. So we went into the debrief. We outlined the steps that we took. We heard from them, we listened. We took in what their frustration was, of course, and then we outlined the steps to them. And then additionally, we said we have two options here. We can provide a letter to the sponsor outlining where the FOA was in contradictory language, or we can provide to them a conversation and let them know why we pursued the way that we did. They didn't want to provide a letter, understandably so, because they have a relationship with the sponsor and they didn't want to come across as whining or nitpicky on, or even a blame game. And so instead we opted to do an informal conversation with the sponsor. And it was actually perfect because in the conversation, as we showed the steps, the sponsor immediately responded after seeing the language, putting their head in their hand and just shaking their head like, oh, I can't believe this happened. So it was really great because again, it brought that human factor back into it. And it was nice for the technical team to see that as well, but they also still felt validated and heard because we didn't approach the conversation, formalized. We took a personable approach to it. So it was a really good feeling. At the end of the day, the proposal did not get reviewed. We will try again in the future. But what the sponsor has said is that they have every step to change the FOA from avoiding it happening in the future. And the team felt really like our relationship and our trust was repaired. So in that way, I think all in all, it was a win-win. Next slide. So what are some of the challenges in adopting these measures? So obviously you have some things that you have to overcome. The first is your workload, right? So we have quite a bit of workload. We all manage, multiple facets of our desk, and taking the time out to address the time that it takes to address these sensitive issues, it can be labor intensive. I can tell you that in the 2 weeks that this has happened, we're in the midst of September and October deadlines. We have a conference, there's several competing elements here, but having taken that time out, I think it was time well spent. It allowed me to ground myself into the situations and better understand what we needed to do to overcome them. Limited prior experience can also be the case. So for example, you could be in the business for years, but not have come across a specific experience or circumstance. And no 2 days are the same in this business. So, call upon others, bring in support where it makes sense. And that's really what this presentation is about too, was calling on experience from others so that we could share, because take that back and apply it to your own situations. Institutional culture is another one. The institutional culture, at the end of the day, you have to recognize you can only control what you can control. So for me, I can check my ego out the door. I can check my need to be right. I can acknowledge and take ownership where it makes sense. But at the end of the day, I can only support the policies that are set forward. And if those policies, if there's waivers of faculty missing deadlines or difficult conversations, and it stems from a policy that maybe has gaps, sometimes you just have to let them go and own what you can have an impact on. Then there's the fear of impact on professional reputation. At first, anytime these things happen, your first inclination is, I don't want that black eye. I don't want people to think that I'm not 110% at all times. But the real truth of the matter is that I think generally people take these moments and they take how you respond to them and they respond to that. So it is still a component of your reputation to be able to handle these situations with grace and poise. So there is something seriously, that I can appreciate now looking back, and I'm glad and thankful that I took the higher road, or the road that was a little bit tougher to swallow at times. But I think it went a long way with my relationships. What did you stand to gain? So obviously I stood to gain just being right, but I think that I stand to lose quite a bit more, which is different, understanding and appreciating a different perspective, that partnership and collaboration, and building and repairing any respect or trust as a result of that. And of course, any potential fiscal impact that was made to the institution. And I think we may have one slide that we skipped. Can we go back one? Just kidding. It is not skipping. Okay, go to the next one, April. Okay. All right. You want to take this one?
Sure. Okay, so one of the things we wanted to make sure we mentioned in this is, as much as we want to resolve conflict, there are going to be situations that are toxic that we just can't for, a number of different reasons. And if any of you have been following the news with the whole Gabby Petito situation, that's kind of a really good example of what happens, in kind of really toxic situations. So hopefully you would never be in that kind of situation in a work environment, but it's just kind of a really unfortunate example that's just right there in the news right now. So there's kind of a lot of different ways that you can identify toxic situations and toxic individuals. And these are just 3. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but are some of the more common things. Someone who repeatedly criticizes you or accuses you of things with no justification for those claims, someone who lies constantly or twists the truth as a tool to manipulate, or someone who doesn't respect your boundaries. And those are all situations that, you know, you cannot really get out of those situations on your own. And that's when you need to bring in that additional assistance to someone who you can trust, that's outside of the conflict, that can kind of provide you with assistance and with support to help, you know, move you out of that toxic situation. So that's kind of a Debbie Downer slide, but we thought it was important to include. So next slide, please.
So the main thing here and the takeaways is that in all situations, displaying respect and ensuring that at the end of the day, you feel comfortable with what you're representing with you and your name and your brand. You forget the ego and you take ownership where it makes sense. That doesn't mean to take apology for something that you did not do, or to go along with misrepresented data at the end of the day, but go to the extent that you feel comfortable in acknowledging the role that you played, remembering the facts. You know, at the end of the day, you know what has been done, and we're all documenting everything that we do all day. So you have the facts there to support you at the end of the day, and then find the solution. Sometimes it's not going to end perfectly. You are not going to end with a perfect scenario every time. I can assure you, not having a proposal reviewed is the worst thing that can happen in the business, but having a solution where your PI views you as a colleague and a partner in the situation, and that you both found a common ground on the solution, is just as much of a win, truly, because the fact that my PIs felt like they had buy-in into the process and finding the next steps in the solution, it goes a long way. And then this one was really big for Grace and I. We want for you all to remind yourselves to be kind even to yourself. So this is an incredibly difficult job, and what we do, and we do make an impact, but even in today's, especially in today's reality, it is incredibly important to remember that it is okay not to be okay, and it is okay to not give 110% all the time. And at the end of the day, give yourself some grace to refill your cup. So, next slide.
So this is just a little bit of additional reading that you can do. These are not heavy articles. I mean, topically, they're a little bit heavy, especially when it comes to the toxic situations. But these are some good little articles to read, just to kind of give you a little more background on these different topics, if you have a moment or two. Next slide, please. So we're open to talk about any of this. If anybody has any questions or any comments or situations that you want to talk about that you've had come up at work, or how you handled conflict that was resolved in a positive way, we'd love to hear it.
Thanks for that presentation. I like this opportunity to take a step back and reflect. And I guess I just want to say, or see if others experience this, or just thoughts on it, or maybe it's just a statement that we all think on, or people are like, oh, okay. But being in research development, so I do a lot of proposal review, and run a lot of grantsmanship training, sometimes focused on specific funders and specific funding opportunities. And I find myself often in the very advice-giving, subjective interpretation of things, you know, going out on a limb, especially as a relatively new person here, and telling faculty what to do, and what directions to go, and what types of things to write and not write. And I guess I'll just say it opens us up to a lot of these potential for later blowback, or, you know, coming in conflict with what they've heard from others. And so I guess I appreciate this topic, that it was included in. Yeah, just say that it resonates, particularly in these types of activities, like the proposal development and trainings that I do.
I think I would just add that, and I agree, I think it's a good topic. I can appreciate for faculty that they invest a enormous amount of time, and it has to do with, if they're funded, that's their career for several years and all of this. And, I feel like research development can be a big responsibility. I mean, ultimately, we always tell them that, the proposal is yours, and even when we edit, we say, these are suggested edits, because we never want to get in the position where, this becomes ours, because it's not, it's their research, but we're adding value, but also they have a right, if they disagree, to not do that. And I think a lot of times communication can get hurt when there are assumptions made. And so like spelling those things out, I think, are so important. When you're working on proposals, laying out the, having the talk and figuring out who does what when, and so there's no assumptions. I think communication in this area is just so important, because you can work together great as a team as long as everybody understands, what their roles are. I think is important. And I think going back to what I started to say is, they're so invested in this, it can be a touchy thing for them. So it's always good to remember, as much as we're invested, this is, they can live and die by these grants. So anyway, my 2 cents.
Thank you, Grace and Tamara. It was a really helpful presentation. I'm kind of like, I feel like I had to deal with faculty members where I wasn't sure if we could get on the right page, and it did seem like the more that I showed interest in their research, the more I basically told them I thought it was like, worthwhile work, they seemed to become nicer to me. But I will say that, like, because the Office of Research Development is housed within the Office of Research. So if I'm helping them with like a grant proposal and then they end up not getting it, and specifically if they end up not getting it for an internal competition, which is held through the Office of Research, it feels, very bad for me, because I feel like maybe I almost think some of them come to us thinking, okay, well, if they prove it, then that's kind of like the final check. It's almost like we were their teacher, and if like the teacher looks it over, then you'll get an A, if you do all the things the teacher said. But that's not really the relationship, and I guess that's been something I've been like, struggling with. Anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Grace or Tamara.
I think it kind of comes back a little bit to what Beth was mentioning about knowing the role, but it's important not only for us to know our role, but for the faculty to know our role. So, reiterating to them the components that we can make an impact on, making it clear to them that at the end of the day, this is still their proposal, their project. I know, like, for Josh and I both, we've had the uncomfortable situation before where we've helped you basically prepare a start to finish application for an internal proposal, but we have to reiterate numerous times that we are not here to shed light onto what others are doing. We're not here to help secure a competitive edge. We are not the inside scoop, so just sort of, I guess, building that line of where we can start and help you and support you, and recognizing that reaching out to us early is a component of being potentially more successful, because you're getting things ironed out, but we are in no way, shape, or form, able to carve into the inside, components of the actual solicitation or program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll also just add to that, I think Tamara brought up something really good with internal competitions. Since our team helps to coordinate and facilitate a lot of the programs through the Office of Research, it is something we intentionally do is we collect the feedback from everybody as much as possible, and we don't try to qualify it and say, well, they're furious because of this ridiculous reason. We get all feedback because many of the programs we do are recurring, and we specifically do that so that we can say in future rounds, we have considered the feedback and made that into how changes can be made in the future. So even sometimes it's even that is means a lot to faculty members to hear that their voice matters in the competitions internally, because this will happen with recurring programs. If they think they don't have a voice in it or it's not clearly understandable, then that must feel terrible for them to put yourself into their shoes. So we specifically tell us we have meetings about the feedback before going forward.
Thank you, Josh.
We also advocate people from the departments to talk to whoever their representative is on the Council of Research and Creativity, because that way they have someone who may not be a direct reviewer, but who is aware of the review process of that internal funding program, who might be able to walk them through, okay, well, this is what the reviewer said, this is probably what they meant by it, to kind of match them up with someone who has that experience as a reviewer for that specific program. So that's another thing that we can offer.
Thank you, Grace.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you so much for your feedback, and we really appreciate you joining us on this presentation.
Thanks, everybody.